So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and run the program, the ImageStreamGang case study program as a web service. And so you'll see I'm going to start running it. That should pop up this little window here, and that will begin to run. And you can see it starting up. This is much like your assignment. If you run the server part, you'll see these things show up, and it'll say, for example, it's listening on port 8080. So that guy now is up and running. So let's kind of make that window a little smaller. Now let me go over here and show you what the web server is looking like. So here's the web crawling application. And as you can see here, this is a Spring Boot application. And like pretty much every other Spring Boot application, it starts off by saying spring application.run, and it gives the web crawling application.class file as a file, along with any arguments. And that will then launch things to be up and running. Now, what is going to be up and running in this case is the web crawling controller. So that's the piece we're going to look at now. And this is essentially a REST controller, as you can see here, that's going to take requests coming in from clients, and I'll show you a client here in a minute, and it's going to handle either post or get requests. So let's take a look and see how this works. You'll also see that we have an auto-wired service called web crawling service, which is implemented here. That's what actually does the business logic. So this is the typical decomposition between a controller that handles incoming HTTP requests, but very little else, and just forwards on to the corresponding service that actually does the work. So let's take a look at what we do here. Here's a method called run, and that is mapped to the /run portion of the URL that's being passed in. So that's how we're going to get the client to tell the server to run this particular endpoint method. And as you can see, it's a post mapping, so it's going to handle post requests. And what it's going to do is it's going to tell the web crawling service, please run the tests. And the web crawling service over here, which is just the implementation of these various methods, is just going to say, hey, ImageStreamGang, please run all the tests. Well, you've already seen that method. We talked about that one earlier. That runs all the tests. So all those tests are now going to be run in the server when requested by an incoming request, a post request from the client. So the client's on some other machine perhaps, or in this case, it's on this machine because we're doing a test. But the point is it's making an HTTP post request to the service in order to be able to run the tests. So those tests will then be run by the direction of a client. And that, of course, will build up that request map. And then you're going to see that there's another method here. Oh, but before we talk about that, what we do is we give back a response to the client saying, everything worked. We give back the HTTP status OK response. There's another method here, however. This is perhaps more interesting in some ways. This is the timing results method. And this is going to get the results. So assuming we've just run the tests and it left the results in that hash map, the results map, if you then call the get timing results method, well, if you're going to send over the URL that has the /timing results portion of the URI, that will end up being mapped by Spring in its REST controller to this get timing results endpoint method. And this endpoint method is going to forward to the service and say, please get the timing results. And as you can see, all the service does, it's very simple. It just turns around and says, hey, ImageStreamGang test, please get me your timing results. And that method says, sure, here you go. You computed that when you ran it earlier, and now I'm giving it back to you. That comes back as a map of strings to lists of longs. And we then take that, and we take that timing results map, and we're going to stick it in a new response entity, which is what gets returned from this endpoint method. And that will then be encoded using the magic of reflection in Java. It'll take the contents of that timing results map, and it will go ahead and encode them into JSON in the appropriate format corresponding to a map. It will then send that back over to the client, and the client will then display it. And we'll take a look at that in a second. So you can see it's going to come back here essentially as a response entity. And just take a look here. Looks like it's telling me I can make this code a little more concise, and why not? Always like to make the code more concise. Okay, so that is basically the web controller, and it's also the service, which is doing the work, and both of those things are then relying on our pre-existing implementation of the ImageStreamGang test class to run the tests and then get the results back. All right, so that thing is up and running. You can see it's up and running here. If we go over to the run window, you can see it's up and running, so that's good. So now let's go ahead and crank up a terminal. So now I'm on my MacBook, and I'm going to say curl, which is a way to send URLs on a command line, -x, and we'll say post, and then we're going to give it an endpoint, which is localhost 8080, because that's the endpoint we're listening on. And then we're going to give it the method we want called the endpoint method, which is going to be run. So that'll go off and crank away. And if we go back over to run, you can see, lo and behold, this is what's being output on the server side. So I'm running this on my laptop, but in practice, I would run the server on one computer, and then I would run that command line on some other computer, and I wouldn't type in localhost. Of course, I'd type in the host name of the server. So you can see that the server just executed all the operations. Now, there was no response that comes back to the client, so it just returns. But now let's do something else. Let's go ahead and say curl x get, and let's put in timing results. So you see up here, timing results. We're now going to send a request to the server to get back the timing results. And lo and behold, that's what we get back. So you can see here that it tells us for each service, Reactor 2, RxJava, Parallel Stream, RxJava 1, Sequential Stream, it'll basically give us back the results of running the tests. And we could then display that. And if you recall, we ran the test twice, once for the big files and once for the smaller files. And that's why we've got essentially a list of results. So the Reactor 2 for the big files took 357 milliseconds, and for the small files it took 92 milliseconds, and so on. So that's just the JSON encoded results that come back from calling get timing results. So all the stuff about having to encode things from a map into JSON and then whatever else you need to do, that's all handled for you by Spring. Now, if we were actually writing a real web client, of course, we would take that JSON back and we would turn that JSON back into a native or a local Java reference type, like a map, right? And of course, there's mechanisms that you can use for a whole bunch of different client-side libraries to do that transformation automatically. But what I wanted to show you right here was how you can take an existing application, which we started off with our image crawler, our ImageStreamGang test program. We wrap that up with a Spring-based web app, which has a controller that takes incoming requests, and you can see how we generate those requests from the command line here. And it takes those requests, sends them over to the server. The server takes those incoming requests, converts them into the corresponding Java code, and then forwards to the corresponding implementation methods that are part of the service. And then that in turn goes over and asks our ImageStreamGang test program to do its thing. So we're able to basically take existing code that was not designed to be accessed remotely and then encapsulate it in a nice server where we can access the contents remotely. And there's very, very little programming here other than just doing the mappings correctly.